But then when you come to today's text and listen to what he says to King Saul, you see the third lesson that every adolescent and a whole lot of adults need to learn. When David stands before the king, offering himself as the one to go and fight against the Philistine. Look at verse 33. Verse 33 in chapter 17, verse 33. It's the first thing I want you to see about this third lesson. Look at it. Verse 33. The king presumes to assess David's ability based on his perception and what he could see. He could see that David was a boy. He could tell that David was a teen. He could accurately discern that David was an adolescent. But he presumed to assess David's ability based solely on his perception and what it was that he could see. He told David, verse 33, you are not able. Look at him assessing David's ability. The king does the same thing his daddy had done by omitting him from the roster of his progeny that he paraded before the prophet. The king tells David, you are not able. How does he reach that conclusion? Because David was just an adolescent. He said, look at me. He said, you are just a boy. The king plays the same old sorry song David's brother played, only the king plays it in a different key. What are you doing here? That's what his brother said to him. What are you doing here? This is a place for men. You ain't no man. The king transposes that song into a minor key, if you will. I love that pun. He tells David, you're still a minor. You are not able to go up against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, a minor. And he has been a warrior from the time he was a teen. Some people are always ready to tell you what you can or cannot do based on what they know other folk have been able to do or not been able to do. When I was a young pastor, Pastor Moss, I shared my vision for God's church with a group of pastors who were much more experienced than I ever thought I would live to be. Some in the room were old enough to be my father, and some others in that room were old enough to be my grandfather. I told the group of seasoned saints that I wanted to build a congregation. We were supposed to stand up, tell who we were, where we served, and what we had done of significance. 3 things. Well, I was brand new. I'd only been here 3 months. So for the new pastors, you had to tell 3 things that you hoped to do with God's help. And I told that group of seasoned saints that I wanted to build a congregation. We had 87 adults, and I was 30 years old. I wanted to grow a congregation. I told these senior servants of the Lord that was made up of PhDs and no Ds. A congregation that cut across socioeconomic lines. A congregation that included every educational level possible. A congregation of folk who were not ashamed of being black like the white folk had taught us to be. A congregation that embraced our history, embraced our heritage, embraced our culture, embraced our music, embraced our story, embraced our Christ, embraced our Savior, embraced our Master, and a pastor who was in his 70s. I was 30, please remember. A pastor in his 70s said to me what Saul said to David, you will never be able to do that. You are just a boy. In fact, his exact words were, boy, what makes you think you're going to be able to do all that? You don't know the nature of the giant you are going up against, and white supremacy is a giant, not just white racism. White racism is a disease that infects white people, but white supremacy is a giant that conquers the minds of black and white people. And this giant called white supremacy is over 400 years old. You are fighting a giant that is 10 times older than you are. What makes you think you're going to be able to do all that? That was in July of 1972. My answer to him on July 17th, 1972 was the same as David's answer in 1 Samuel 17, verse 37. The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the Lord who saved me from the paw of the bear is the same Lord who will save me from the hand of the Philistine. In other words, David's identity was given by God and David's worth was assigned by God. But most importantly, David's help came from God. Sitting out there with those sheep had taught David some invaluable lessons that neither Saul, Eliab, nor Jesse knew anything about. We learned about those lessons that David learned as a shepherd later, because David wrote about those lessons, and we still recite what David wrote today. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. David wrote, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? David wrote, the Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? David wrote, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. David's help came from God. And when that seasoned pastor asked me on July 17th, 1972, what makes you think you're going to do all that? I paraphrased David because I knew, like David knew, where all my help was coming from. I said, what makes me think it? That answer that Paul gave when he said, if God be for us, who can be against it? That was in 1972. Look at God. This is 2007. Look around you, if you will. If God be for us, who can be against us? My help comes from the Lord. They said to me, you ain't gonna never do that. You ain't gonna build or fill no 600-seat sanctuary down the street at 532. I said, if God be for us, who can be against us? They said you can forget about a 2,700-seat sanctuary. And when construction stopped on this facility for 2 years, the tongues went to wagging and the naysayers went to bragging. I told you, black folk can't build or pay for no $16 million facility, especially with all them poor folks up in there. One of our City members told me I was attracting the wrong element. I was attracting the poor folk, the unprivileged folk, the uneducated folk, the unrich folk. He ain't gonna never get that built. I said, if God be for us, who can be against us? Guess what? It's not only built, it's paid for. Guess what? We got 30 more acres of land just a few blocks east of here, on which God is getting ready to build a whole new community, school, houses, apartments, senior citizen complexes, businesses, a health club, a gym. My help comes from the Lord. If God can resurrect a 3-day dead Jesus, surely God can restore hope to a community that has died at the hands of gangs, drugs, and the side effects of white supremacy. The internalization of self-hatred. Hope can replace self-hatred. Hope can overrule hopelessness. If God be for us, who can be against us? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Listen. If he made heaven and earth, what is 30 acres to him? But that's not, listen. That's not where the lessons for my adolescence stop in this passage. I'm almost through. Y'all have to see, I'm almost through. Look what happens next. Look what happens next. Saul tries to give David his armor. Saul tried to give David his helmet. Saul tried to give David his coat of mail, his bulletproof or arrow-proof vest. And when David put on what worked for Saul, he found out very quickly that he could not walk in somebody else's stuff. And he could not win using somebody else's weapons. What worked for Saul wasn't working for him. 3 more quick lessons for my adolescents, and then I'm going to leave y'all alone until God gathers us again. Your identity is given by God, adolescents. Your worth is assigned by God, adolescents. And your help will come from God. But